I'd like to begin with a 7-part breathing meditation. This is by Ed Bastian, who has researched all meditation practices in all the world's religions. And he's come up with this one that he thinks is kind of in common, or with all 7. So just be comfortable in body, in spirit. Take a deep breath just to kind of breathe in the morning and to release tension. And maybe another 1 or 2 deep breaths just to settle down. Breathing in and out, say to yourself, may we be happy and healthy. Breathing in and out, say to yourself, may we be grateful. May we be transformed. May we be loving and compassionate. May we be mindful. May we be wise through meditation. And may we be in service to self and all. For our text today, which is Romans, I would like us to read the text twice. The first time, just read it, and I'll show it on the screen. And then second time, I'm going to read it with a little assignment for you to consider, then we'll talk about it. But I'd like to have 2 readers, just one reader read the entire passage through once, and then I'll give an assignment, and then a second reader to read it a second time through. Who's our first reader?
I'll do it.
Flurry is the first reader. Who will be the second reader? Andrea. Okay, go ahead, Flurry.
Romans 5, verses 1 through 8. Therefore, since we are justified by faith, we have peace with God through our Lord Jesus Christ, through whom we have obtained access to this grace in which we stand. And we boast in our hope of sharing the glory of God. And not only that, but we also boast in our sufferings, knowing that suffering produces endurance, and endurance produces character, and character produces hope. Disappoint us, because God's love has been poured into our hearts through the Holy Spirit that has been given to us. For while we were still weak, at the right time, Christ died for the ungodly. Indeed, rarely will anyone die for a righteous person, though perhaps for a good person, someone might actually dare to die. But God proves his love for us in that while we still were sinners, Christ died.
Thank you. So here's our assignment. I hope you'll take it in a spirit of fun. Romans and fun don't often go together, but I'm going to try. If Paul were sitting right in front of you, Paul's the author of this. If Paul was sitting right in front of you, what questions would you have for Paul? If Paul were sitting right in front of you, what question or questions would you have for him? So with that in mind, Andrea, could you read it a second time?
Excuse me. Therefore, since we are justified by faith, we have peace with God through our Lord Jesus Christ, through whom we have obtained access to this grace in which we stand. And we boast in our hope of sharing the glory of God. And not only that, but we also boast in our sufferings, knowing that suffering produces endurance, and endurance produces character, and character produces hope, and hope does not disappoint us, because God's love has been poured into our hearts through the Holy Spirit that has been given to us. For while we were still weak, at the right time Christ died for the ungodly. Indeed, rarely will anyone die for a righteous person, though perhaps for a good person, someone might actually dare to die. But God proves his love for us in that while we still were sinners, Christ died for us.
Thank you. So looking at the text one more time, if Paul, who wrote these words, were sitting right there in front of you, alive and well, of good body and sound body and mind, what would you ask Paul? If you want to follow along with the text, you'll have to get your own, because I'm going to stop the screen sharing now so we can see each other. And we've been joined by JS. Hi, JS.
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
And
Hello.
Andrew's with us as well.
Yes, hey, Andrew.
He's somewhere.
Yeah.
There he is.
There are two fingers from Andrew and a thumb or something. So let's just leave it wide open. I've done some research on this, which is helpful for a pastor once in a while to look over some of the basics about Romans. Again, it's such an important letter in the Pauline corpus, as they say. So, but I don't want to try to answer the questions. There might be some factual things I could help with, but I also want this text to, and our questions about the text to speak to heart and experience and today, as well as history and facts. So if Paul were here, what would you ask him? I saw
Why God rarely died for the righteous, or Jesus,
Jane, say that again.
why Jesus rarely died for the righteous. Is that right? Am I getting that quote right?
You're speaking about verse 7, I think.
Yes, while one will hardly die for a righteous person, though perhaps for a good person, one will dare even to die.
And what's your question to Paul about that?
Well, what's wrong with a righteous person?
Why he said it.
Let's just get some questions out there, and then we'll take it from there. Junior?
What do you mean by righteous, Paul?
Thank you.
Yeah.
By the way, Paul Van Zuden, none of this is pointed at you.
My question is this. You say hope does not disappoint us, but I've often hoped for things and been disappointed. Maybe we mean something different by hope. What do you mean by hope?
What an awesome question. Who else has a question? Andrea, and then Jean.
Well, I was just going to comment on what he just said, actually. So I don't have, I have another question, but do you want?
Let's just take some questions, and then we'll maybe kind of take them in order.
Okay.
So go ahead with another question, Andrea.
Well, it says Christ died for the ungodly. Yet, I mean, if he died for us, did he really think we were ungodly?
Thank you. And maybe one more, and then we'll kind of have some conversation. Greg?
Yes, I'd say, forgive me, Paul. I haven't read this entire Corinthians yet, but you say boast, boast, boast. Wait a minute. We're not supposed to be proud, are we? Why don't we just, act instead of, boasting?
Thank you. All right. How about one more, maybe? Anybody?
Yeah, Elaine here.
Yes.
I have a question for you first before I ask the question to Paul. When was this written?
About 55 to 58.
Okay. So my question to Paul would be, why did you wait so long to write this?
Now, I'm not Paul, but I think sometimes a little sharing of context is helpful. I do not speak for Paul. So the first question was about verse 7. So verse 7 in its entirety says, "Indeed, rarely will anyone die for a righteous person, though perhaps for a good person, someone might actually dare to die." I puzzled over that too. And I found a good explanation of that verse. What Paul means here from what I read is a hero might die for a good person. That's what heroes do. But not even a hero would die for someone who's undeserving. But Jesus would die for everybody. So that was a question from Jane and Chuck. If that were Paul's answer to you, would that be satisfying? You don't have a satisfied look on your face.
So he really didn't mean a truly righteous person. He meant a falsely righteous person. And that's the way I interpreted what you said.
You know, I think we have to determine what righteous means. To me, a righteous person is one who feels they're right without taking into consideration anybody else.
It's wrong.
And a good person is a man who plays by the rules, the golden rule, and considers everybody. And I think that's the difference between self-serving and just.
That was a good question. Right.
So that's the second question. So let's pull back from this verse and kind of look at Paul's overall intent here. Paul's intent is to tell the Romans whom he's never met. He's never visited their church. He did not found their church, but he's intending to pass by on his way to Spain. Paul's trying to explain to them the significance of the Jesus event. What's it all about? For Paul, what it's all about is God setting the world right through the death of this Messiah. And in verse 7, what he's saying is, look, maybe once in a while you'll find someone of superior character, let's say a hero in one of your Greco-Roman myths, who will die for somebody who's deserving or not deserving. But there aren't many people who would really go to the extent that God has done by sending Jesus to die for both the deserving and the undeserving, the righteous and the unrighteous. In Paul's view, the world is not well. The world is from the beginning broken, askew, askance, unbalanced, unwell. And what God started in the covenant procedure with Abraham and Sarah, God has now finished, or is in the process of finishing now and in the future through the death of Jesus, which isn't just for the righteous, but even for the unrighteous, which in Paul's view is really everybody. We all stand on the side of brokenness, but through the covenant gift of grace and our faith in that grace through what God has done through Jesus, we are all made righteous, or are in the process of being made righteous. Is that is that helpful? I'm just trying to share some knowledge I gained from reading the commentaries on Romans here. So when he says righteous, the only righteous one is Christ. And it's through Christ's righteousness, as exhibited through a righteous death on the cross, that we are all brought back to where we should be. And sin is annulled. Sin not being a bad thing you did in the backseat of your father's Chevrolet, but sin being that fundamental human brokenness.
I think we sometimes get confused between the word righteous and the term self-righteous. I think Eleanor was probably referring to self-righteous when we talk about someone who thinks highly of themselves and acts superior, as opposed to a righteous person who actually does the right things and acts humbly. So I think we just don't use the word righteous in our everyday language, but we use self-righteous. So I think that's a little hard to get into our minds what the word righteous means.
I'd like to move on to Mel's question for Paul and then open it up especially to how does this possibly speak to us today as individuals or as a society. Hope does not disappoint us. Mel's experience is like other people's experience, that they have hope for things that did not happen. And so in what, and hoping has actually ended up in a situation of disappointment. So what's Paul talking about here? Paul's making a transition from chapter 4 to chapter 5. And all the commentators seem to say about Romans that chapters 1 through 4 are about what God did in the past through Jesus to set the world right, both Jew and Gentile. Chapters 5 and beyond are about the benefits that accrue to those who put their faith in what God has done in Jesus. And in the hopes of an ultimate culmination of righteousness on earth, an ultimate perfection of righteousness on earth. Paul's hope is that that not long after Jesus came the first time, he's going to come back and he's going to make it right. Paul really believed that within the first century, everything would be concluded, and that his window of missionary work was narrow between Jesus' death and resurrection and perhaps just a very few years. This was his opportunity to bring the good news to people that, wake up, realize that this old world is going to be restored soon. Get with the program. It's good news. So anytime Paul uses the word hope, he doesn't mean it in a psychological sense. He really means it in a cosmic, apocalyptic sense. God is about to set all things right. It's a very deep kind of hope. It's not like I'm hoping I get a car for my birthday. It's hoping that everybody, Jew and Gentile, will see and embrace what God has done for us and live in that way. Yes, Andy, your hand there. And you are muted.
Sorry. I'm sure my family would like that feature on me. But anyway, thank you for pointing that out, that I was muted. I understand what you just said, Jeff, but I just would like to say from a personal perspective, when I read that, from a very personal perspective, what it says to me is hope is available to us. And if there's ever a time when you don't feel hope, it's a very desperate feeling. And there's only been one afternoon in my life, and I kind of remember this clearly, where I kind of lacked hope in this particular situation. And I thought, oh my, I can't go there. So to me, it's the access to hope and to make things better. And if you lose that, you kind of lose your will.
And if you look in the text, what's the first step in hope?
I don't know. I didn't read it closely enough.
Well, I'm not just asking you, Andrea. Anybody.
See.
Does that go back to suffering?
Exactly.
Yeah.
This is what, this is what a lot of preachers use for this. We don't know what Jeff's going to say today, but hope doesn't start with a Hallmark card or a warm blanket or something. Hope starts in the depths, and you build your way up. And in that way, maybe what Paul's talking about is more realistic. It's not just hoping for hope's sake. All we have left is hope, and so on. It really starts in the where sin has crushed us. And again, sin not being a bad thing you do, which is the popular definition of sin, but rather the presence and reality of brokenness and evil in the world, which runs through all of us. either as victims or as perpetrators or whatever. Go
We disagree with that.
ahead, JS.
My personal experience, having been a person who suffered greatly at one point in my life, and I don't suffer now, it's a state of grace. It's a state of emotions. It's a state of mind. It's a choice as to how you respond to the cards that you've been dealt. And I no longer think of humanity as, or at least myself, as broken, despite what you're seeing on your screen. And my view is whatever separateness I feel from the divine, I have only to seek it because it is already there. It is not a matter of being broken. It's a matter of not perceiving what I really am. I just forgot, but that doesn't mean I'm broken.
Thank you. I think Paul would say he's saying much the same thing, except how God has made the world whole and each individual whole is through the definitive act of Christ on Good Friday.
To which I would also disagree, that we've always been this way, even in the time of Abraham.
Mm-hmm. The commentary I read was written by N.T. Wright, who's a former Anglican bishop who's very well respected New Testament professor now at Oxford. And N.T. Wright says you can't know and understand anything about Paul until you remember that he's Jewish and that he sees everything through the lenses of covenant. God saw a broken world and established a covenant with Abraham and Sarah and to make the world right so that Abraham would eventually be the father of many nations. And all the nations, not just the Jewish nation, all the nations would be brought in. But the entire program of covenant is based on a broken world. Not just broken individuals, but a broken world. And that covenant is the remedy, the divine remedy. And N.T. Wright says that what Paul realized, maybe even before he was a Christian, was that this covenant project is not done yet. It's a story without a conclusion. And in fact, from Paul's view as a first century Jew, the covenant has just kind of petered out. The nation of Israel has become occupied by a pagan, demonic empire headed by Caesar. What's God going to do about it? And when Paul met Jesus on the road to Damascus, Paul got it. It's like, oh, this is the highly unlikely way that God has decided to conclude the covenant. And good news is it's for all people, just like God said to Abraham originally. It's for all people. I think all the world's religions eventually come to the point where they have to deal with brokenness, pain, suffering, difficulty, what Christianity has called, unfortunately, original sin. It's just not all roses and puppies and scotch and flowers all the time. It's struggle. And how do you deal with that? This is the Jewish and Christian way of dealing with it, is to speak in terms of covenant. But for Paul, the covenant, God's final answer to a covenant that seemed in disarray is to wrap it up with Jesus. Not only when Jesus came the first time, but in our awakening to what God has done through Jesus the first time now, And when Jesus comes, whenever that is in the future, Paul thought it was within the first century. He was wrong about that, apparently, because we're still very broken.
And again, I would disagree, but that's okay.
Yeah, even the world's religions have to deal with the ego. All, you know, in my interfaith studies of spirituality, all the world's religions have ways of addressing the human tendency to promote and protect self and groups, as opposed to promoting the welfare of all. And each world religion has a way of addressing that, whether you call it sin or whatever. There's a place at which you have to deal with suffering in the world's religions. Marcy, I saw your hand, didn't I? Mm-hmm.
Yes. Am I unmuted?
You are good.
Good. I'm struggling in putting this with what is happening today and the horror again of another Black man being shot in the back. Where is our hope? We're perhaps going back to the covenant, but help me put this in today's context.
So we've got 9:20. Let's start with that. When I just get to 3 quick questions, then we'll go to that. There was a question: did Paul really think we were ungodly? Yes. Ungodly is another word for weak. You could use other words: unreconciled, askew, askance, and so forth. Yes, the entire human race is, in that sense, ungodly. It's another word that Paul uses for the state of not being fully reconciled to self, others, and God. He uses ungodly as another sort of flagging word for that. Boast, I want to get real quick to Greg's question about boasting. Now, Jeff is, I think, talking about this, so we'll see if my interpretation of Paul is the same as his or something different. But I found a very good way of understanding boasting. It doesn't mean self-advertisement in this sense, which is like the only sense that we know the word boasting in common English. So what Paul really means is, what do we have confidence in? And the NIV and other translations actually say rejoice. What can we rejoice in? What's our firm foundation? The NRSV just uses boasting all the time, and that just kind of throws people off. Is that helpful, Greg?
Yes, thank you.
What do we have confidence in?
I like that. What can we rejoice in?
And then the very last question, then we'll get to Marcy's good question too. Elaine asked, why did you wait so long, Paul? This is the mature Paul. This is one of Paul's final letters. Paul doesn't have much time left on this earth after 55 or 58 AD. He's on his way to Spain. His idea is to stop off in Rome, see the Romans for the first time. This letter is like a massive introduction of his thinking to them, so he doesn't have to go through all this territory when he gets there. And then he's going to leave Rome and go on to Spain. Well, the story is he's arrested and executed in Rome. Not by the Roman Church, but by the Romans. So Elaine's question is, why did Paul wait so long? Do you mean, why did he wait so long in his career?
Yeah, I just was, it just seemed such a long time from the point where Christ died and was resurrected and then to this point.
Yeah, well, Paul, like any other person, is in process. He did not become a fully mature theologian right away. But Romans is really considered his masterpiece.
Ah, okay. Interesting.
And it's not written to a church with a clear problem, like most of his letters are, although N.T. Wright actually does identify a problem in Rome, in the church that Paul is writing to. But this is a mature Paul, and New Testament scholars and preachers spend more time on Romans than any of the other letters of Paul, because it's a kind of all his thoughts are right there. Marcy, let's go to your question and talk about it. Can you restate it?
You're muted.
Yeah, you're muted again. Sorry.
Did that work?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. My question was, how does this passage work with the horrors that we're living through today? Where is the word hope?
Okay. So now that we've maybe over-established the context for these words, what do you think? How does this speak to our unique situation?
I think that evidenced by all the movements and marches that we see around the world, I think that we have more hope now than we've seen in decades. It's a very unusual situation to have COVID-19, but then maybe more people were conscious of that we are connected globally. But I think we're in a very unusual and very hopeful stage of our world right now.
Yeah, I mean, Paul might say, look what came out of Jesus' suffering. Good news and a resurrection, a vindication. And again, for Paul, hope starts with suffering. But how do others maybe consider this passage in light of the last few months' events?
Well, I'm also inspired by it. Now that we've put this word hope in a larger context, we're talking about an existential state of hopefulness. And yes, all traditions understand that suffering is common. It always has been. And maybe we in Winnetka are just being shown the suffering of others that we really didn't see as clearly up until recently. So let us take hope in this and realize what we can do that maybe we just didn't realize we could do before. Just going down and talking to the people of Bethel, last week, we saw how they live, we talked to them face to face, and we know how we can help each other. The sufferings. What was it? I think, Jeffrey, you said the all faith traditions. Isn't rule number 1 of Buddhism, all life is suffering?
Exactly.
They get it.
Yeah.
I would only add that, the steps are multiple. Suffering produces perseverance. There's been plenty of suffering and plenty of perseverance. And then perseverance leads to character. And I think we're seeing character emerging, stronger character, maybe broader defined, well thought out character. So I guess my hope is that the character of us as individuals, as well as the nation and internationally, will be strengthened. Then we get to hope. So I think we need to focus on building our character and seeing how necessary that step is.
I wonder if this awakening that seems to be happening in our country is not just good news for people of color, but for white folks too, who have sought for a long time to kind of understand why we have such divides and disparities. Maybe now it's becoming a little clearer, which is kind of liberating in terms of our social analysis and then how we ought to live in response. I know that feminist critiques of male-dominated societies can be liberating for men because they lead to a toxic masculinity that makes us the need to overperform and underfeel. And, so many things about toxic masculinity are deadly for men. And I find hope in seeing the world through feminist lenses. And I think maybe the same thing is kind of happening here for white folks as we really begin to see what life is like for those of us who look more like me. So this could be good news for everybody. I'm hoping. Maybe I'm just being too crazy hopeful. Junior, what do you think?
No, I totally agree. And I think one of the things that we need to be doing is working it through the political sphere to change many of the things that are going on. Both speaking out and all of that is terribly important on a one-to-one basis. But I think if we don't get involved in the political sphere and make major changes in healthcare and housing and education, in how the taxes are used, then we're maybe going to go back to where we were. And I think we all want to move forward. I agree with you. There's a tremendous amount of positive energy in the world, not just in our country. And then and now that we see things with our eyes that we didn't see before because of videos, it really brings it to us. And I think that's terribly important.
I think I personally am hopeful because it seems to me just through my own family, my youngest child and husband, they've started a book club on the book White Fragility. I don't know if you've heard about it, but Fan just had an interview with the author, Robin DiAngelo, and the vice principal of Evanston High School. It was very interesting. I am reading the book and part of this virtual book group, but I think that these young people in, even high school and younger people are trying to understand that what they don't know. They're not just trying, they're marching, but they're also, before you can do anything, you have to understand the issue is. And that seems almost superficial, but in that book, in the very beginning, the author gives a definition of bias, prejudiced, racist, race that's so much more encompassing than my pea-brained definition of those words. And the author, who is white and grew up excessively poor, asked and in the beginning she said, in the interview, she said, even though people thought I was white trash and my family was this and all of that, they also thought that at least I was better than the Black people. And so at the end of the interview, she said to the Black assistant principal at Evanston High School, what would be like a final comment or something. And he said black people want white people to speak up for them, but not speak for them. And there's a big difference there. And I think that's what, in some ways, I mean, in the beginning when Pastor Jeff brought us potential fellowship or whatever with Bethel Baptist, people were saying, well, so what are we going to do, and how is it going to work, and what are we going to, and his approach is more, well, let's see. We can't go tell them what they need. We don't know what, we think we might know what they need, but they know what they need. And that isn't necessarily always a quick fix. Anyway.
Thank you. Yeah, Robin DiAngelo is a leading light on this matter. Yeah, Jean?
I just want to say that there were 8,500 people, I guess, on that Zoom call.
Oh, yeah.
And it's on their website. They're going to post it. They recorded it. It's on the fan website. So if you want to watch it, because I wasn't able to attend, but I understand you can watch it by looking at a link on the fan website.
Right. It was very, the rapport between them was very good, and they had obviously spoken before they recorded this.
Yeah.
And one of the other things, and I still haven't figured this out, but she said to him, what's the one question that when you're asked, or sort of a statement that when someone says to you, you're just speechless? And he said, when a white woman comes in, I'm not prejudiced, I'm not racist, I'm married to a black man. And he says, he's done. He can't even finish that, because it's not, because when I and many white people think of someone who's racist, you're thinking of the Klan, you're thinking of people who are, shooting people in the back. You're thinking of this real violence that, just because someone looks different. But it's more than that. I mean, those are awful, awful things. But it's more than that. And that, because we don't totally understand what the definitions of these words encompass, we become very defensive because we don't see ourselves as bad, violent murderers.
Yep. So let's spin out Robin DiAngelo's vision for our society. Who benefits?
Everyone.
Everyone. This isn't like white people helping black people.
Right.
That's the attitude that's gotten us into a lot of the problems already. This is, we are all being held back by our racial attitudes. And she's a leading light again in this regard. Jen, did I see your hand flash there? Jen Guy?
You did. And just a comment I'd like to make really to Marcy's point. I feel like Paul's letter is so, it applies to us right now. It's as though he wrote this letter directly to WCC or the current Christian church. Because to Marcy's point, you see these acts of violence, you see social injustice continue for so many years. And Paul is living in hope that we will be reconciled with God. He thinks it soon. We've learned, at least in terms of our framework of time, it's going to take longer. but I think he can speak to us in that I think he would be saying, if he was sitting right here, don't be discouraged, or try not to be. Look for signs of hope, because it's easy to be discouraged in this current environment. But be encouraged. Reconciliation with God's kingdom is possible. All people can live, maybe that's a little Pollyanna, but I still think his letter is right on target for our time, because it's very easy to be discouraged.
Yeah. I'd like folks to appreciate Paul as a cosmic thinker, a mystic, really. His practical problem in all his churches is, should we let Gentiles in without requiring circumcision of them? He says, oh, of course, but that's just the start of it. His view is that the whole creation is moaning for its healing and reconciliation. I mean, his vision is almost beyond human beings to everything that has been created ever. And that one day God is going to bring it all together. I mean, we tend to think that Paul's a Christian bigot because of some of the things he says about women and gays and so on. His vision is actually the most inclusive vision in the New Testament, my opinion. But starting with Jew and Gentile. And since humanity in Paul's mind was either Jewish or Gentile, he means all of humanity. Everybody's coming in. Everybody. Okay, I'll stop preaching. Be well, everybody. See you at church at 10.
Okay.
Well,
Thank
thank
you.
you.
Thank you.